Welcome back to Trevor in Tokyo. This week I finally got my computer parts here and my computer built, which means I can finally edit at a reasonable time and not melt down my computer. So I thought it would be fun to look through building my PC in Japan. Let's find out together. Trevor in Tokyo. So the first thing to note is that Amazon is everywhere. Like a squid spreading throughout the entire world, its tendrils exist all over the planet. And in our case, that means we get really fast computer parts delivered overnight. This is the Amazon web store for Japan. What did I decide to build for my computer? Well, the first thing your computer needs is brains. I wanted a computer that would be able to handle multi-threading fairly well to allow for better video processing, but also be strong enough to stand up to various applications that I've been using it for. I ended up deciding on the Ryzen model rather than Intel in my case. Next, we needed our GPU. The GPU is usually going to be the most expensive part of the machine and the one to splurge on. So depending on your applications, you definitely don't need a high-end GPU. Now, the Ryzen model has an integrated GPU inside of the CPU, so I don't need a discrete graphics card immediately, and indeed, I don't currently have one in the machine now. This is similar to what I might purchase. Next, of course, we needed our motherboard. There's different types of motherboards for different form factors of your machine. I didn't want to have to deal with issues of cooling, so I just got the ATX motherboard, which had plenty of space on it, and I needed something which was compatible with AM5. Next, I needed RAM. RAM, of course, being the part of the machine which holds the random access memory for working memory, if we're making an analogy to nervous systems. And it's probably the part of this system where you can be a little bit more budget. I selected a 2 by 16 gigabyte kit, which would give me high performance, which would be matched with my GPU. Next, for storage. Now you can go with a traditional HDD, under SDD, or an M2 form factor SSD. I selected the newer type to hold my OS system. I wanted the maximal speed with the lowest latency, and the motherboard can mount 3 of these things. Next, we needed our power supply unit. So the size of the power supply and wattage is going to depend on the CPU and the GPU, where generally speaking, Intel CPUs tend to burn more power than their Ryzen counterparts. Now, interestingly, in Tokyo, there are 2 different types of line frequency for the electricity. There's the 50 Hz and the 60 Hz. Now, usually this depends on the country, but in Japan's case, it depends on the region of Japan. Based on how much the power supply was left when the Americans arrived. Now, the CPU that I chose didn't come with any sort of cooling. This system is quite cool, and I haven't had any problems with my computer. It stayed no higher than 45°C. Finally, we needed a case to put it all in. Now, this is where I had a bit of difficulty because when I last built a computer, I had plenty of options to choose from. But in Japan, they're basically all the same type of case. And there are some very strange-looking mecha-inspired cases. But I wanted something which would be modular, ATX, glass cooling and access, and wouldn't be too ugly on the eyes. I ended up going for this ATX model here. Now, the interesting part. So I took all that I purchased on Amazon.co.jp and compared it with a similar or identical item out of Amazon.com based out of the US, took the prices in Japanese yen, converted them into USD at the time of research, which at that time was 144 Japanese yen to 1 USD, and we can compare the differences. So the first component is the CPU. So in Japan, this basically broke down to a $360 CPU. So in Japan, this turned into about is a $360 for a new GPU. Whereas in America, on American Amazon, you'd be paying about $304, which represents a 118% relative cost. Now note, I did buy this one on sale because I got a used model. It's a very expensive part, so I wanted to get the most bang for my buck. The next is the GPU. Now, I didn't purchase my GPU, and like my CPU, I will probably buy this one second hand off a site like Mercari or similar. But if I was to purchase it on Amazon, as mentioned before, it would be as follows. For the cheapest relative value model, which was a 460 MSI style RTX NVIDIA GPU, you'd be spending around $350 in Japanese yen, whereas on Amazon, this price would be $448, possibly due to scarcity, markup, and scalping on the side, which represents a relative cost of 78% for the GPU relative to America. As for the motherboard ended up breaking up into $147 USD, which is reasonable priced for a motherboard in Japan, but the same purchase would cost you $191 in America, which means it's a relative cost of 77% in Japan. As for the RAM, I just chose a budget RAM which had a sufficiently high clock speed and also reasonably high RAM, which broke down into $90 in the Japanese Amazon, but about $96, $97 in American Amazon. So these are pretty comparable, with Japan having a relative price point of 93%. Now, one thing that I found particularly interesting was storage in Japan seemed to be quite more expensive than in America. So the purchase that I made with an SSD was just simply from a manufacturer that I've heard of before and trusted. So I selected from P&Y, known for their good quality, with the 1 terabyte drive costing me about $81.53. But the same drive in America would be $58.63, which means Japan has a markup for the SSD of about 139%. And this seems to be fairly consistent with the SSDs versus America. So for whatever reason, America has cheaper storage. The PSUs are simply comparable. The PSU that I selected, which was an Asus 750 watt gold rated 80 plus model, was about $109 in Japan, and the same thing would have ran me about $114 in America, meaning that the Japanese price was about 96% of cost. The cooling unit, the fancy little radiator that I splurged on a little bit, turned out to be about $92 in Japan, but would run you $130 in America, meaning that this one part had the highest relative discount in Japan compared to the US, represented a 71% price point compared to the US. And finally, the case. So I just selected a case that was sufficiently useful for my purposes There were cheaper cases, there were more expensive cases, but I managed to find the same case to make a price point comparison. In Japan, I spent what would be around $125, and America, the same case for me, about $130. So not much of a difference, but Japan had a slight discount at 96%. The total, thus, here for the Japanese computer would be about $1,357 in Japan and $1,475 in the US, which means an average overall discount of 8% relative to America. Now, the caveat here is that Japan has a 10% use tax universally applied across pretty much everything, from food to consumer electronics. So, to look at the net cost, to make a apples-to-apples comparison, I took off the tax value at 10/11ths of the price, and that means that the Japanese net cost would be $1,234 to the American net cost of the same, $1,475, meaning that the Japanese value was about 84%. Now, of course, these numbers are going to change depending on if you are in a state that has sales tax. So if you're in Pennsylvania and this is a 10% sales tax versus you're in Oregon and a 0% sales tax, this exact number is going to vary. But overall, the Japanese market is a bit cheaper depending on which purchases you want to make. And where we were paying the most was for our CPU and with our SSDs. Now, interestingly, we actually paid less for our GPUs, but I believe that the difference in the GPU price might be due to a difference of scalping in the market, versus in Japan, Bitcoin mining and scalping aren't really issues, which lead to an overall less cost in Japan versus the US. Now, of course, there's one big asterisk to that, and that is that the American salary on average is probably twice as high as the Japanese salary. So even though Japan is maybe 16% less in terms of the net cost of the computer, the impact on one's salary is quite higher. So if you just double this number comparison. Anyhow, that's all for this week. Hope to see you again real soon. This has been Trevor in Tokyo. See ya next time.